We have met here today to talk about the well-being of boys and men, half Earth's population. This morning I described the situation boys face when there is no father. This afternoon I ask you to think along with me briefly about what we must do on their behalf as public officials, teachers, clinicians, parents, and yes, mentors, this new group. While everyone here must respond, and soon, the urgency to do so must be felt first and foremost by men themselves, I think. Men must take the lead, and I think Celia would agree with me. And I remember that one of our first conversations, and in reading what she has published, her adamant position that while women obviously have a great deal at stake here, it's up to men to make some important moves at this point. Here and everywhere, the situation of boys and young men, especially the generations born since 1970, has put them at risk. They're vulnerable, often disappointed, and not because of over-expectations imposed on them, which had been the case for generations of men through my own, the baby boomers. As documented, many have dropped out of sight or been left behind. All of us here know the details, especially the statistics about rates of school failure, suicide, unemployment, incarceration, ascertained psychopathology of the kind John spoke about earlier. Well, while we wait as the world slowly wakes up to the meaning of these data, and that is happening, but ever so slowly, to my ongoing amazement, I am here, thanks to Dr. John Ashfield. Before opening this session to discussion, or again, perhaps we'll have not so much discussion, but for some concluding exchanges, I want to say a few words about what I've been doing, supplement a bit what I said this morning, and suggest what we must do after we leave here later this afternoon. All of this is offered in the spirit of being proactive and, I hope, creative. My position is unabashedly pro-male. We must acknowledge what men do well and celebrate those whom Celia Lashley has so movingly termed our gorgeous boys. And I was not here, and she knows why, but I'll bet she used the word gorgeous more than once, and that's a great word. My interest turned to boys' lives about 12 years ago, when after 30 years teaching many college-age males and working with males of all ages as a psychotherapist, starting age 10 on through the 30s, 40s, I noticed that something had changed. You know, we always see too late that something has changed. In any case, with a few exceptions, my male students were less engaged. They had lost some of their verbal sheen. They seemed less present, existentially less there. They were already increasingly not there at all, physically. As I mentioned in the Q&A, now they account for less than 40% of all college students in the States. And I'm not sure what the numbers are here, but I suspect that they're fairly similar. My observations, in any case, got the attention of a few colleagues in academia. So you're interested in gender studies, and men's studies, they asked. I had heard these terms. This is, again, not so many years ago, 12 years ago. I knew there was a women's studies program on the campus at Wagner College, where I've taught since the mid-90s, but I knew nothing about it firsthand. No, I'm not interested in gender, I would say, not really knowing what I was not interested in. My background was in clinical psychology, and before that in continental philosophy. To be honest, I had not paid much attention to this discipline. I had started reading around, as a result, and learned there was, by 1999, a 30-year movement called men's studies, part of which had been inspired by Robert Bly's mythopoeic revivalism for mostly middle-aged, often damaged men. Sam Keen's fire in the belly had flared up, but was soon reduced to ashes, however, and a certain kind of heartburn resulted, for which there was no ready remedy. As I read more, I became more and more alarmed, though. I was soon telling others what I had learned about the increasingly dismal situation most males find themselves in, not just boys and college-attending males. For 7 years, I edited the International Journal of Men's Health and launched a journal of boyhood studies, the first of its kind. I committed myself to understanding what had happened to most men, to blokes, not just to the privileged few that we hear so much about, those who have a lot of money, prestigious positions of power, but most men, and to do something more broadly, not just for the young men and boys I worked with in the consulting room and the classroom, but for the many lads and young blokes out there who are known not to be in anyone's care. As you see, I have been for something, not against anything. No blame. Fast forward, where am I today? I'm in Adelaide for my second delightful visit here. I was looking for some parrots in the tree, but I was here in October the last time, and they've evidently gone for the season, so I missed them. In any case, here I am in Australia, where male studies has already advanced with more deliberateness than anywhere else, thanks to the steady efforts of colleagues such as John Ashfield and other Australian scholars, physicians, policy makers who collaborate with their counterparts in the States, Canada, and the U.S. under the auspices of the Australian Institute of Male Health and Studies. Later this year, as John mentioned earlier, the Institute will launch New Male Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, to disseminate what male studies is accomplishing. I'm pleased to say, Pete, I'll be editing it. I've been formulating some recommendations about what we must do next, and that's where I'll take us through the remaining minutes of this symposium today. Allow me to give you a few of these, not all of them, a few of these. In doing so, in making some recommendations, I will also tell you a bit more about what I've been up to and prepare the way for some questions, unless we're too tired and just want to go home. About 8 years ago, after my realization that something was very amiss for my college students and for boys, I put together a Psychology of Men and Boys course. In preparing to teach it, I returned to my psychoanalytic beginnings. I realized we must focus on experience, not just behavior. So I think that is the first thing I would recommend we do when we leave here today. We must try to understand the experience of boys that motivates their behavior being failing at school, defaulting on everyday life, by perhaps unconsciously choosing to go to prison, or impulsively deciding in a heartbeat that it would be better to be dead. As the meager results of 100 years of scientific psychology attest, we learn very little from looking only at behavior. Understanding why things happen as they do and what in particular plays itself out must be based on an appreciation of experience. This, I think, is essential to keep in mind. That would be my first recommendation, that we refocus from the social science perspective that has dominated the study of behavior to a study of a consideration of experience, of what's motivating boys' behavior and young men's behavior. Focusing on experience will mean listening to what boys have to say. This is my second recommendation, that we listen to what boys and our remaining fathers have to say. We must listen to those boys who have fallen afoul of the failing family, but also those who have managed to remain optimistic. At Wagner College, the second of 7 men's centers on college campuses nationwide was established 2 years ago, as I mentioned. I'm repeating myself here, just I didn't know that I'd have a chance to say this when we had the Q&A. But in the safe spaces provided by, and I want to mention the person's name, the Harold and Lynn Thurer Men's Center, and I'll tell you just about this couple. Young males are afforded an opportunity to meet and listen to each other's questions and learn from each other how best to negotiate a very difficult time for them. Harold is an alumnus of the college, and he has a 14-year-old son, and he and his wife were very enthusiastic to provide financial support, which they did for a 2-year startup period this year, which is just over, and another amount for next year. After that, we're on our own, but I'll be looking for other alumni to do this. In any case, these centers are, I think, an essential element in this. What they say, as I said before, to each other remains among them, but I know from them that their discussions often continue in pairs when they leave weekly meetings. Eventually, as I meet with each of them informally, I hear about what is on their minds. What they tell me is that often after an initial hesitancy, nearly all of them have found the gatherings sustaining and often enlightening. So I therefore recommend that we establish such safe spaces for young men, and reported on some examples of those. And I want to add one here, and that is one that I became aware of, one possible setting, and that is men's sheds, which I became acquainted with 4 years ago here in Australia, and there's nothing like that in the States. And as I learned about them here, I found a place for elderly men who gathered together and found support that they could only give each other, but also that these turned out to be wonderful places for mentoring. And so young kids, often enough kids who were in trouble or homeless or fatherless or parentless, could come in these very quiet places, making things in these sheds, making things with hand tools and such, and without a lot of discussion, find support and mentorship in these older men. On the other hand, the older men were finding the youth suffusing them with energy that they could only have fond memories about. Listening to boys is always enlightening, but sometimes useful too. So this fall, on the suggestion of the new moderator of the Wagner group, a fellow called Jeff, non-college men of the same age from the surrounding community will be invited to join the group. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And this will mark a new phase in the development of our program. This idea came from Jeff. It hadn't occurred to me, a Bulgarian-born biopsychology major. Something so obvious had not occurred to me. It seemed obvious to him, since he had at least 3 male friends who want a forum in which to talk to each other about what is happening in their lives. He mentioned it to them, and they said, "Oh, that's cool. When is it starting? When are you getting back to doing it?" He told them about it at the end of the semester. They'll be joining in the fall. But there is, of course, darker news that they tell me. From other young men in the group, I've heard the stories of not feeling welcome on campus, of doubts about their bodies, of family situations in which they were moved between parents during the first decade of their lives, even pressures to marry when they're not really ready. Most guys will now probably not marry until their late 20s. In any case, some are still under pressure by families to do that. For better or for worse, it depends upon the guy. I have also seen their resilience, though, and watched them put into play solutions to the puzzles and problems they face. To allow themselves to talk to each other often requires long periods of time, weeks and months. One member of the Wagner men's group, Rob, told me that he had had a lot of doubts about the value of the meetings. He wrote to me, "I haven't been present much," it's an email, "haven't been present much, and my only excuse is laziness. I am sorry, more so because I haven't followed through on promises like this before. I must change and hope that I can. The only way to reverse this pattern of flaking," does that ring a bell here in flaking, "will be my efforts. But you know, I have greatly enjoyed every